When your own child tells you that you're a burden, something inside you quietly breaks. My son didn't yell or argue when he said it. He said it like he was stating a fact, calm, tired, almost casual. "Dad, you've become a burden to us." Those were his exact words. I just looked at him, smiled faintly, and nodded. Then I went to my room, packed a small suitcase, and left the house I once built for him with my own hands. 2 days later, he called me 28 times. But by then, I was already gone. My name is Edward Walker. I'm 68 years old, a retired carpenter, and a widower. I've spent my whole life working with my hands, building homes, furniture, anything that could make someone else's life. I raised my son, Michael, alone after his mother was 12. I worked extra hours to pay for his school, skipped meals so he could have, and he graduated college. I stood in the back of the clapping so hard my hands hurt. That moment felt like my life had been worth something. After I retired, I sold my workshop and moved in with Michael and his wife, Grace. They lived in a nice suburban neighborhood, a quiet street with trimmed lawns and friendly neighbors. They had a daughter, Ella, my granddaughter, just 7 years old and full of light. I loved that little girl like she was the last piece of my heart still beating. At first, living with them felt right. I helped out or fixed the fence, cooked breakfast when they were late for work, and took Ella to school. I even started carving small wooden ashes for her, the way I used to do. She'd run to me, jump into my arms and say, "Grandpa, what did you make today?" Those moments, every old bones disappear. But as months passed, I started to notice changes. Grace stopped smiling, entered the room. Michael became quieter, distracted, always on his phone or laptop. When I asked simple questions, "Do you need me to pick up Ella today?" he'd sigh and say, "Dad, I've got it." It was a small thing, but those small... One evening, as I was setting the table for dinner, I overheard them talking in the kitchen. Grace's voice was low but sharp. "Michael, this isn't working. Your father's here all day. He means well, but it's exhausting. He forgets things, and I can't keep cleaning up after him. He's becoming a burden." Michael's voice came next. Soft, tired, but agreeing. "I know. I just don't know what to do. I can't send him away, but I can't keep this up either." My hands froze over the plates. I wanted to pretend I hadn't heard it, but every word burned in my chest. When I sat down to eat, I couldn't even look at them. The food had no taste that night. Later, I went to Michael's room. He was sitting at his desk, typing something on his computer. I stood quietly by the doctor until he noticed me. "Dad, what's wrong?" he asked. I took a deep breath and said, "I didn't mean to make things hard. If I'm in the way, you can tell me." He frowned and shook his head. "Dad, you're not in the way. It's just, you need a lot of help lately, and Grace is already managing so much. You don't understand how busy we are." I nodded slowly. "You're right. I don't understand your world, but I do understand when I'm no longer wanted." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "That's not what I said." I smiled faintly. "You didn't have to." That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with the lights off, watching the shadows on the walls. Every sound in that house used to make me feel at home. Ella's laughter, Grace's cooking, the TV in the background. Now it all sounded like reminders that I didn't belong. I thought about my wife, Margaret. She'd always told me that one day, when we got old, we'd live with our son and be surrounded by family. "He'll take care of us like we took care of him," she used to say. I guess she was half right. She wasn't here to see how wrong the world had become. The next morning, I watched from the porch as they left for work and school. Ella waved at me from the back seat, and I waved back, forcing a smile. As soon as the car turned the corner, I went inside, opened the small wooden chest where I kept my savings, and pulled out a few $100s. I took my old suitcase from the closet and packed only what mattered: a few shirts, my shaving kit, my photo album, and the wooden toy car I made for Michael when he was 5. When Grace came home that evening, she didn't find me sitting in my usual chair. The house was quiet, but on the kitchen counter, I left a single note. Before you hear what it said, I want to ask you something. Have you ever given your whole life to someone, only to feel like you don't matter anymore? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more stories that remind us what truly matters before it's too late. The morning after I left the dinner table in silence, I could feel the shift in the air inside my son's home. The place that once felt warm now carried the chill of distance. Michael barely looked at me as he got ready for work, and Grace moved around the kitchen quietly, her eyes fixed on the dishes instead of me. I sat at the small breakfast table, the smell of coffee filling the room, and tried to remind myself that this was still my family, even if it felt like. But when Michael, without saying goodbye, something inside me finally broke. I didn't want to admit it, but I knew I had overstayed my welcome. For months, I had seen the small sign, the tired sigh, the half smile, the way Grace moved her things farther from where I sat on the couch. I had told myself it was in my head, that family go through difficult times. But the truth had been spoken now, clear and sharp. I was a burden, and once that word is spoken, you can't pretend it wasn't said. The next few days passed quietly. I kept to myself, spending most of my time in the small garden behind the house. I trimmed the hedges, pulled weeds, and watered the flowers, though my hands trembled from age. Grace would occasionally look at me through the window, her expression unreadable. I could tell she felt guilty, but guilt doesn't erase words. It only lingers in silence. That week, Michael came home later than usual every night. He looked exhausted, but when I asked if everything was all right, his tone was short. "Work's fine, Dad. You don't have to worry about everything." That last part stung. I wanted to say, "I'm your father. It's my job to worry," but I bit my tongue. I was tired of being the reason for his frustration. One afternoon, I was sitting outside on the porch when my neighbor and old friend Lily walked over. She had known me since my wife and I first moved into this neighborhood, decades ago. Her silver hair glowed under the sun, and she carried that same warmth she always had. "You look troubled, Eddie," she said, sitting beside me. "What's going on?" I didn't answer right away. I just stared at the street, watching a few kids ride by on their bikes. Then, I finally said, "My son told me I'm a burden. I think he regrets letting me stay." Lily's face softened. "Oh, Eddie, I'm so sorry. He doesn't mean that. Sometimes people say cruel things when they're overwhelmed." I nodded slowly. "Maybe, but it doesn't make it any easier to hear. I worked my whole life so he could have everything I didn't. I was so proud when he bought this house, when he became a father himself. I thought I'd done something right. But now I can't shake the feeling that I've become one thing I never wanted to be, a problem." She placed her hand gently on my shoulder. "You've given enough, Eddie. Maybe it's time you think about yourself for once." Her words lingered long. That night, I sat at my small window and looked at an old photo of my wife. In it, she was holding me as a baby, both smiling, their faces lit up by sunlight. I whispered, "You'd know what to do. You always did." But she wasn't there to answer, and I had to find the answer. Over the next 2 days, I started making small preparations. I took my important papers, some clothes, and my saving, what little was left, and packed them into a small brown suitcase. Every time I heard Grace's laughter with my granddaughter, I smiled. I didn't want to take that away from them. I wanted them to have their peace, even if it meant I had to find mine somewhere. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening. Grace and Michael were arguing quietly in the living room. I was in the hallway, and couldn't help but overhear. Grace said, "I can't keep doing this, Michael. We barely have space, and I feel like we're walking on eggshells." Michael replied in a low, defeated tone, "I know. I don't know how to fix this. He's my father, Grace. I can't just tell him to leave." There was a pause before she said softly, "You don't have to tell him. He already knows." I stepped back, my heart pounding. She was right. I did know. And for once, I wasn't angry. I just felt tired. Tired of pretending everything was fine. Tired of waiting for affection that had turned into obligation. That night, when the house grew quiet, I wrote a short note and left it on the kitchen counter. It simply said, "Don't worry about me. I understand now. You have your own life to live, and I don't want to make it harder. Take care of each other. Tell Ella that Grandpa loves her more than anything." I folded the note neatly, placed it under the salt shaker so it wouldn't blow away, and looked around the house one last time. Every corner held a memory. The smell of Grace's cooking, the sound of my granddaughter's laughter, Michael's voice as a boy asking me to read him bedtime stories. Then, just before dawn, I picked up my small suitcase, opened the door quietly, and stepped out into the cool morning air. The street was empty, the sky a pale shade of blue. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Some goodbyes don't need words. They're spoken in silence, with the soft click of a door closing behind you. As I walked toward the bus stop, a strange calm washed over me. I wasn't angry, and I wasn't afraid. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. I didn't know where I was going yet, but I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't running away. I was simply leaving room for my son to learn what love costs when it's taken for granted. The bus ride that morning felt endless. The kind of silence that wraps around you and forces you to listen to every thought you've been avoiding. I sat near the window, my small suitcase tucked by my feet, watching the city fade into open fields. For years, I had driven this route for work, but this time it felt different. There was no destination, no plan, just a quiet need to go somewhere I could breathe again, somewhere I didn't feel like an unwanted guest in my own family's life. I didn't go far. Just 2 towns over, there was a small coastal village where my wife used to spend weekends when Michael was young. She loved that place. The smell of salty air, the sound of seagulls circling above the docks, the way the ocean seemed to stretch forever. I hadn't been there in nearly 20 years, but when I stepped off the bus, it felt familiar, like walking an old photograph. The streets were calm, the sea breeze gentle. I found a small inn owned by an elderly couple who didn't ask any questions. I paid for 2 nights in advance and told them I just needed some quiet. That evening, I walked along the shore, my shoes sinking into the damp sand. The ocean was calm, the sun dipping below the horizon in soft orange light. I thought about Michael, how small he had looked when his mother passed away, how tightly he used to hold my hand. I thought about how much I had sacrificed to raise him alone, and how somewhere along the way, I must have lost him to the world that taught him money mattered more than time, and pride mattered more than love. As I sat on an old wooden bench facing the waves, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small photo. Our family, taken before everything changed. My wife stood behind us, her hands resting on my shoulders, smiling down at the boy sitting on my lap. Michael couldn't have been more than 8. He was missing one of his front teeth and laughing like life couldn't touch him. I traced my finger over the image and whispered, "You'd know what to say to him, wouldn't you, Anne? You always did." That night, I slept better than I had in months. The sound of the waves outside the window was comforting, almost like hearing her voice again. For the first time, I didn't feel angry or hurt, just tired of trying to hold on to something that no longer wanted to be held. I told myself that maybe by leaving, I was doing Michael a favor. He could have his peace, and I could find mine. Back at home, my absence began to spread like a shadow. Grace found the note on the kitchen counter first. When Michael came home that evening, she met him at the door, holding the paper with trembling hands. "He's gone," she said quietly. "He left this." Michael read the note once, then again, as if the words would change the second time. His face went pale. "What do you mean he's gone? Where would he go?" "I don't know," she said, tears filling her eyes. "But Michael, he meant it. You need to read this part." She pointed to the line that said, "You have your own life to live, and I don't want to make it harder." Michael's chest tightened. He grabbed his phone and started dialing. The first call went straight to voicemail, then the second, then the 5th. He called my number 28 times before the night was over, but each time, the same recorded voice told him I wasn't available. He sat on the couch, phone pressed to his ear, listening to the dial tone over and over again. Grace tried to comfort him, but he pulled away, whispering, "I didn't mean it. I didn't mean what I said." Meanwhile, I was sitting by the pier, unaware of the panic unfolding back home. I spent that day helping the innkeeper fix a broken railing, something to keep my hands busy. I told him I used to be a carpenter, and he smiled, handing me his tools without question. The simple act of working again gave me peace. Every hammer strike felt like a small reminder of who I used to be, a man who built things, not someone who was in the way. That night, as I watched the stars over the ocean, I finally allowed myself to cry, not from pain, but from release. I had spent so much of my life giving, forgiving, and holding on. Now, for the first time, I was letting go. I whispered into the dark, "If my son ever needs me, he'll find me, and if he doesn't, I'll still be okay." But back in the city, Michael was unraveling. He hadn't slept. He had called hospitals, police stations, even old family friends. Each time, his voice grew more desperate. "Have you seen my father? Please, it's important. He barely noticed the exhaustion creeping into his body. He kept replaying that last conversation in his head, the words, "You're a burden," echoing like a curse. 2 days later, on a gray Sunday morning, Michael drove to Lily's house, his last hope. "Please," he begged. "You've known my dad forever. Do you know where he might have gone?" Lily looked at him, tears in her eyes, and said softly, "I think I do." She told him about the coastal village, about how Edward and Anne used to go there when they were younger. Without another word, Michael ran back to his car and drove through the rain, praying he wasn't too late. As he sped down the long stretch of road toward the ocean, I sat by the pier, watching the waves roll in and out, thinking I had finally found peace. But I didn't know yet that peace wasn't the end of this story. It was only the beginning of something far more powerful. The morning air at the coast was cool and still, the kind that makes every sound seem louder. I was sitting on a wooden bench by the pier, the same spot I had sat the day before, holding a small cup of coffee that had already gone cold. The waves rolled softly against the shore, and the seagulls circled overhead, calling out like they had something to say. I had spent the last 2 days in quiet reflection. No phone, no noise, just me and the sea. It felt peaceful. I thought maybe this was where I'd stay for a while. I didn't know that at that very moment, my son was racing down the coastal highway, his eyes red from tears and exhaustion, searching for the father he had once told was a burden. By late morning, I heard the sound of tires skidding against gravel. I turned my head slowly and saw a car pulling up near the pier. The door swung open, and a tall man stumbled out, his clothes wrinkled, his face pale. It took me a few seconds to recognize him. It was Michael. He looked nothing like the confident man who used to rush out of the house every morning in his suit. He looked smaller, younger, broken. When his eyes met mine, he froze. For a brief moment, we just stared at each other, neither of us moving, neither of us speaking. Then he started walking, slow at first, then faster, until he was running. He stopped a few feet away, out of breath, his chest heaving. "Dad," he said quietly, almost in disbelief, "I've been looking everywhere for you." I stayed, seated, watching him carefully. "Why?" I asked softly. "I left a note. You have your life. I didn't want to be in your way anymore." He took another step closer, his voice shaking. "Because you weren't in my way. You were my way, Dad. My whole life, everything I have, it's because of you. And I forgot that." I wanted to be angry. I wanted to remind him of the words he said, the way he looked at me like I was a weight around his neck. But when I saw the tears in his eyes, I couldn't. He wasn't the proud, distant man I left behind. He was my son again, the same boy who used to run into my arms after school, who once told me I was his hero. He sat down beside me on the bench, his voice breaking. "I didn't mean what I said. Grace was upset. Work was stressful. I let everything pile up, and I took it out on you. I didn't realize how cruel I was until you were gone. When I saw your note, I couldn't sleep. I called 28 times, hoping you'd answer. I thought something happened to you." I looked down at my hands, the wrinkles deep, and the skin weathered from years of work. "Something did happen," I said quietly. "I finally believed what I never thought I'd hear from you. You said I was a burden, Michael. And when a father hears that from his own child, something inside him changes." He swallowed hard, his eyes wet. "I know, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. I said those words out of frustration, not truth. You were never a burden. You were the only steady thing I had." For a long moment, there was silence between us, broken only by the waves and the faint creak of the pier. Then I said, "You know, when your mother was sick, I used to think about this very thing, what it would feel like to be unwanted. I promised myself I would never let that happen to you. I wanted to make sure you had everything, even if it meant I had nothing left to give. But love, Michael, it's not something you can measure in sacrifice. It only works when it's shared." He nodded, his face wet with tears. "I understand now. I was too focused on everything else, my job, money, reputation, that I forgot what really matters. I forgot you." I turned toward him and placed a hand on his shoulder. You didn't forget me, son. You just got lost. We all do sometimes. He broke down then, leaning into me, his body shaking as he cried. I held him the way I used to when he was little, my hand resting on the back of his head. It had been years since we'd embraced like that, and in that moment, all the pain, pride, and resentment began to wash away. After a while, we sat in silence, staring out at the horizon. The sky had cleared, the sun breaking through the clouds, scattering golden light across the water. Do you remember coming here as a kid? I asked. You'd run down this very dock, chasing seagulls until you tripped and scraped your knees. He smiled through his tears. You carried me, all the way back to the car. You said real men don't cry, but you cried anyway. I chuckled softly. I guess some things never change. We stayed like that for a long time. Eventually, he looked at me and said, Please come home, Dad. Grace feels terrible. She didn't mean what she said either. Ella's been asking about you every night. She misses her grandpa. The thought of my granddaughter made my heart ache. I hadn't realized how much I missed her laughter, the way she'd climb onto my lap and ask me to tell her stories about when her dad was her age. I nodded slowly. All right, I said, but things have to change, not just for me, but for all of us. Home should never be a place where love feels like a burden. He reached for my suitcase and stood up. You have my word, Dad. It won't be like before. I'll do better. We drove back in silence for most of the way, but it wasn't the kind of silence that hurt. It was the kind that heals. As we approached the city, I looked out the window and said quietly, You know, Michael, sometimes we have to leave to remind others how much our presence matters, but I hope you never let it come to that again. He nodded, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Never again. By the time we pulled into the driveway, Grace was standing at the door, tears streaming down her face. When she saw me, she ran forward and hugged me without hesitation. I'm so sorry, Edward, she said. You didn't deserve that. I hugged her back and smiled. Let's not talk about what I deserved. Let's talk about what we still have, a chance to start over. As I stepped back inside the house, the warmth that had been missing finally returned. It wasn't the same house anymore. It was home again. And that night, as my granddaughter climbed into my lap and asked for a bedtime story, I knew that forgiveness wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a way of rebuilding love, stronger, gentler, and more real than before. The days that followed my return home felt like a second chance at life. The house that once carried an invisible heaviness now felt alive again. It wasn't filled with guilt or awkward silence anymore. It was filled with the sound of laughter, the smell of Grace's cooking, and the playful giggles of my granddaughter, Ella. Every corner of that home seemed to whisper something different now. It didn't say you don't belong here anymore. It said, welcome back. Michael kept his promise. He changed in ways I never thought he would. He started coming home earlier from work, leaving his phone on the table instead of glued to his ear. He'd sit beside me after dinner, asking about my day or sharing stories from his own. They weren't grand conversations, just small, real moments. The kind I used to crave. Sometimes we'd sit together on the porch without saying a word, both staring out at the same quiet street. It was simple, but it meant everything. Grace, too, softened. I could see the remorse in her eyes the first few days, but she didn't try to overcompensate. She didn't have to. One morning, I woke up to the smell of pancakes, and she placed a plate in front of me with a small, shy smile. I made them the way you like, she said. That gesture alone was enough. Forgiveness, I realized, doesn't always come in grand apologies. Sometimes it's served in the small moments, the quiet acts of care that rebuild what words once broke. The biggest change, though, came from Ella. She became my little shadow again. She'd follow me everywhere, from the backyard to my small workshop, where she loved to watch me carve wooden toys. Grandpa, she asked one afternoon, why did you go away? Her question stopped me for a moment. I didn't want to burden her with pain she couldn't understand, so I smiled gently and said, sometimes people need a little time to remember how much they love each other. But I came back because I missed you. She nodded, satisfied with that answer, and went back to painting one of the wooden birds I had made for her. Watching her brush each stroke with focus and care, I felt something I hadn't felt in time, peace. Weeks turned into months, and life settled into a rhythm again. I found small ways to contribute around the house, fixing things that needed repairing, helping Ella with her homework, tending the garden. But this time, no one made me feel like I was in the way. When I watered the plants, Grace would often bring me a glass of and sit beside me, talking about her day. Sometimes, when Michael came, he'd quietly sit beside in the living room, not out of obligation, but out of comfort. The distance between us that once felt like a canyon had turned into a bridge. One evening, as the sun set behind the neighborhood, painting the sky in soft shades of orange, Michael joined me on the porch. He looked thoughtful, most hesitant. "Dad," he said, "I've been meaning to tell you something." I glanced at him, waiting. "I've been thinking about what you said at the pier, that love only works when it's shared. I didn't really get it before, but now I do. I spent years trying to give everything to my family, except the one thing that mattered most, my time." He paused, his voice growing quiet. "You taught me that by leaving. I'm sorry it took losing you to understand." I smiled at him, feeling the warmth of pride and forgiveness all at once. "You didn't lose me, son," I said. "You just needed to remember how to look for me." He nodded, and for the first time, I saw the boy I used to know, the one who would climb into my lap after scraping his knees and whisper, "I'm sorry, Dad." Only now, he was a man learning how to be a better one. As the months went by, something remarkable happened. Our home, once divided by unspoken resentment, became a place of togetherness. We hosted small, family dinners again. The laughter came back naturally, not forced or polite. Even the air inside the house felt lighter, as though forgiveness itself had opened every window. And in the middle of it all, I realized something powerful. Sometimes pain isn't a punishment. Sometimes it's a teacher. When I looked back at everything that had happened, I didn't see a story of anger or abandonment anymore. I saw a story of rediscovery, of a father who had to step away not out of pride, but out of love. I saw a son who had to lose something precious to finally understand what it meant to cherish it. And I saw a family that learned how to love again, not because they were perfect, but because they were willing to try. Now, when I wake up each morning and hear Ella running through the hallway shouting, "Grandpa, breakfast," I thank God for giving me another chance to be here. I don't think of myself as a burden anymore, and I know my family doesn't either. I am part of their story, and they are part of mine. Life, I've learned, isn't about avoiding pain. It's about finding meaning in it. Sometimes the words that break you are the very ones that lead to healing. Sometimes walking away is the only way to bring someone back to their senses. And sometimes love needs to be quiet, not to disappear, but to be heard again. As I sit here tonight, watching the porch light flicker softly and listening to the sound of my family laughing inside, I realize I didn't just come back home. I brought home back to us. And if there's one thing I hope anyone takes from my story, it's this: never let pride speak louder than love, because love, once it's gone, leaves a silence no number of missed calls can ever fill. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe to my channel for more stories that remind us how love, forgiveness, and family can change everything. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and who you'd call today just to say you love them.